We're in the season of Lent, which is that time in the liturgical year when we look toward Jesus' final days, the death that he knew was coming, and the suffering that he both willingly endured and dreaded with every part of himself. It's when we consider why it all happened and how he expected his friends to understand it. And the passage we'll be diving into today sheds light on Christ's plan, on God's plan all along. And it reminds us why Jesus was loved and welcomed, and also why he was hated. And we're going to be looking at Genesis 12, and you can listen along. I'll be starting in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." So here we're meeting Abram for the first time before God changes his name to Abraham. And what we see in this story is God showing up and promising good things to Abram. We see God offering gifts that are given generously and freely for Abram's good and for Abram's joy. But what we also see is that the blessings are not intended to stop with him. They aren't intended to be hoarded or preserved just for himself or his family. Instead, they're meant to be shared among all people for the good of all creation, all families in the earth. The people of Jesus' day really liked the first part, the blessing part, right? But they weren't so crazy about the sharing with people not like us part, because it went against everything they'd come to understand about who they were in God's economy and how God works in the world. And I like to think of myself as so different from that attitude and that perspective. But I have to confess that I am much more about doing what's comfortable for me, what I want, protecting myself, than I want to see or realize sometimes. So our text is about Abram's call. And it's had me thinking about my own call, my own purpose. I'm almost done with seminary, just a few more weeks, right? And I've spent all this time, all this work that's been emotionally and mentally grueling, spiritually grueling, and all this money invested. And my husband, Kyle, has had to step in and pick up the slack while I've been traveling and studying and working. And on this side of all of that, I feel like I should be so sure of everything. But the truth is that I still struggle with calling, with purpose, with exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with what God has given me. And I remember wrestling with these same questions back in the 90s. I was still in my 20s at that time, and I'd been studying the biblical concept of shalom. And I was grasping for the first time how big and holistic and how beautiful God's idea of peace is. And I was seeing that it was about undoing harm and rebuilding and restoration, and about individual people living wholeheartedly. And that was a big deal for me because I'd grown up with abuse and abandonment. And so the idea that God wanted me in particular, to be deeply and fully at peace was revolutionary. And it was a big deal as well because I had this idea that pleasing God was mostly about following rules, not making mistakes, doing the right things. And so this idea that a big part of pleasing God was working to become more fully myself, more fully who I was created to be, was incredible. It felt like freedom. I remember this moment one afternoon. in the midst of this, Tori, my daughter, was either reading a book in her room or out playing with friends, and I remember just kind of pushing my books away and my Bible away and just kind of laying back and looking at the ceiling, trying to sort of take it all in. And I remember that deep feeling of peace and joy, and of almost like knots were being untangled and untied inside of me. At the time, I understood part of what God was inviting me to, in living into this wholeheartedness as going back to graduate school, because I'd be adding tools that would make me better, learning things I cared about, again, becoming more fully who I felt like I was meant to be. And so I registered, I got a fellowship, and I began to pursue and complete my master's in sociology, which was what I studied in my undergraduate. And during that time, I did good research, writing stuff that I felt like was important. I loved it, and I'm proud, of some of the work that I did. But it never occurred to me at the time that what God might actually be inviting me to was perhaps going to seminary, because I was being prepared to and invited to walk with people spiritually, pastorally. And looking back, I think the main reason for that, frankly, is that I'm a woman. Because in the context that we lived in, we just didn't see that modeled. I went to friends and mentors at the time, and no one I talked to about what was next for me, no one suggested, hey, maybe you're called to pastoral ministry. And so I went to the University of Houston and pursued sociology. But as I was finishing that process, we moved from Houston to Austin. And it started getting clearer that actually God was inviting me to be a pastor, to be a minister. And so instead of getting a job at UT or one of the other local universities and going on to get my PhD, I started serving at the church. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing what I was meant to do. And I started realizing how few spiritual mothers there were around me, women in pastoral leadership, that weren't either children's ministers or youth ministers, those are wonderful and important things, but they're not my call and they're not my gifts. And I began to see as well firsthand, kind of from the inside, what was lost and what was missing and what was not even conceived of when there were only or primarily male voices in pastoral ministry and in pastoral leadership. And so even as I struggled to find my place in that, I started to see that God had made me as I was, given me the gifts and abilities that I have for me to be fulfilled, for me to enjoy, but that it wasn't just for me. It wasn't just about me, right? And I also started realizing that if I allowed myself to be held back from who I am, what I could be, that I wouldn't be the only one who would be missing out. That who I am, that what I do, that what I have to offer was never only for me. God said, I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So what does all that mean for God's plan in the world and for us in this time now? Because I look around and what I see is a world that is wrestling with who deserves to belong, who deserves to flourish. And there's this epidemic of othering, of defining who we are against everyone else. of walling ourselves off from people who are different from us, either literally, physically, or in the way that we interact in social media and online. And I think a big part of that is that people are scared. I think that we are afraid there's not enough good to go around. And we're afraid that sharing means that we'll be left out. And many of us are pinning very real pain and struggle and loss on someone else, on them over there. Economist Robert William Fogel writes this. He said that the incredible rate at which the economy and society are changing causes people to lose their bearings. They fear not only for their safety, but also for their livelihoods. He wrote this almost 20 years ago, and I think it is only more relevant now. And so, we live in a time in which a Sikh man in his own driveway is approached by a white man who yells, "Get out of our country and go back to where you came from," and shoots him in the arm in his own driveway. And so we live in a time when a white couple from Georgia with a loaded gun comes upon an 8-year-old African-American child's birthday and jumps out yelling racial slurs and death threats. And they're sentenced to prison for it. We're in a time when a white man enters a sports bar in Kansas City, shoots and kills an Indian man. Witnesses say he was yelling, "Get out of my country." All of this since February. That's not us, right? It's hard to believe, actually, that this is really real, that it's happening around us. And our community is intentional. We work really hard to be nothing like that and to actively fight hate. We try to listen to others. We voted. Many of us marched. But we live in a world and in a time that is geared toward keeping us distracted and hyper-focused on what's in front of us, on our choices, our community, our family, our fulfillment. It's not that we don't care. We care, but we get tired, right? And a lot of times, rest ends up looking like, for me, I think for many of us, what should I watch next? How can I unplug? Where should I go for dinner? Should I order in? Or we worry, am I eating right? Am I working out enough? What about retirement? Am I saving enough? Can I pay off my debt, my bills? What about my soulmate? Or if I found him or her, why am I not experiencing 24/7 bliss? And I'm not saying there is anything wrong with asking those kinds of questions. There's not. But I'm saying that so much of our world kind of conspires to keep us focused and overwhelmed by our choices, by our fulfillment, by our protection. And it's easy to forget in the dailiness of life that it's not just about us. God said, "I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." God's plan was and is and remains unfolding to bless the whole world, all the families of the earth. Because God created humanity in God's image, right? We were created to reflect God's way of being in the way that we relate to each other. We were created to join God in delighting in and guarding and stewarding the world. But the first humans, the very first ones, believed this twisted version of truth and lost paradise. And it didn't take long for the whole world to be filled with violence and corruption. And God sent these waves of correction and judgment and cursing in response, a flood, a confusion of languages. But even in the midst of judgment, even in the midst of calling out hate, God made ways for fresh starts, didn't give up on humanity. And yet, we kept going back to old and broken patterns. What was God supposed to do with people who seemed hell bent on doing everything but what was good for them and others? And Abram, by the time we meet him here, he's lost his brother. His wife couldn't have kids. If he didn't have a child to pass his good name and his wealth onto, there would be no one to remember him, no one to tell his stories, no son with his nose, no granddaughter with Sarah's eyes. And then his father died, and he was not getting any younger. And things looked hopeless. And in this moment, what does God do? In this time when even the best of humanity kept replaying the same old patterns, the worst of them were hurting each other, trying to play God. And God, instead of resorting to more punishment, more curses, more correction, God takes a chance on doing the exact opposite. And God invites Abram to leave the familiar behind and promises to show him where to go, and promises that in that new home, God will give Abram his dream of becoming a father. The shame of not leaving a heritage behind is going to be wiped away. God will give him an honorable name. Instead of destruction, God promises blessing. Here's the thing about blessing. In the past 100 years or so, it has become the high fructose corn syrup of religious language, the way we talk about the things of God, right? Overused, sickeningly sweet, and drained of any of its real meaning and depth. Because the truth is that blessing is actually this rich, dense, incredible concept. The Hebrew word, I think you'll recognize it, barak. And barak means this idea of flourishing in every way possible: physical health and strength, fertility, safety, success, abundance. That's barak. And that's what God promised to Abram and his family. And Abram, for his part, chooses to trust. He takes this leap of faith, and as old as he was, he packs up his family and goes exactly where God told him to go. And God shows up there, letting him know he's headed in the right direction. Genesis 12 is a turning point. This is where God starts laying out God's plan to turn the tide. A plan that is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Whenever God shows up after this, God refers back to the promises made here in Genesis 12 to Abram, and acts increasingly to bring them to life. And this is the thing for us. This is what I think we misunderstand with our Western individualism. I think we tend to think that this story is about God and one man, God's chosen hero, right? But this was never about Abram only. God's grace and kindness and abundant provision for flourishing, for Barak, right, were never, never, never merely for Abram. They weren't even just for Abram's unborn children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Listen again to what God promised, starting in verse 2. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So what does this mean for us? It means that any good thing we have is meant for us to enjoy and for us to share. It means that you matter, that I matter, that we are part of the story that begins here with Abram, later Abraham. It means that we're not meant to be isolated individuals trying to figure out peace and fulfillment on our own. I've seen some stories lately, maybe you have too, about how universities are just being inundated by these white supremacists who are doing aggressive recruiting like nothing they've ever seen. The Anti-Defamation League says that there's an unprecedented outreach effort to attract and recruit students on American college campuses. And as I read those stories in light of Genesis 12 and in light of all that God is doing here, it struck me that there is actually something that racists get right. They are right to be searching for a people, for a nation to align with, to protect, to be loyal to. They get that we're not meant to be atomized individuals hanging on to whatever good we can grab and hoarding it for ourselves or our little group. Their problem is that they are wildly mistaken in believing that their people are defined by nationality or skin color or where they were born. Abraham was blessed so that he would be a blessing. We flourish so that we can help others flourish. Ephesians 2 says it this way, starting in verse 13. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one, has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. God invites us to live in light of understanding that God's gifts of flourishing and abundance are for us, and for our community, and for the whole world. And there are times to live at all three of those levels. They all matter. But our world trains us to stay at level 1 or 2 at best, right? Marketing machines thrive on keeping us isolated and self-focused without even us realizing it. God's invitation is into his way of fostering unity and connection that shares God's gifts of grace and flourishing, Barak, with others. God's flourishing it's not meant to be preserved and kept small. It's meant to overflow like ripples in a pond. So what can it look like to respond to all this, to live in light of it? Here's something I encourage you to try for the next 5 days. Every day, at least once a day, try to see someone at your level 3, someone other than you who's also outside of your trusted community of friends and family. Try to see someone at that level, at that distance, as worthy of God's flourishing. Try and see that person as someone God had in mind as part of the all families of the earth being blessed, as part of the reason that you have the good things you have the gifts and abilities and graces that you have. And I encourage you to then act in light of that. So that could look like giving a donation to an aid organization that you care about. It could look like having a conversation with someone you'd usually avoid. It could look like saying a silent prayer or blessing for someone. It could look like taking a deep breath and saying something genuinely kind to a person who stands for something you cannot imagine supporting or embracing. And you can take one of these globes, which, yes, are bouncy balls, and put it on your desk, put it in your pocket, put it in your bag as a reminder that you are gifted, blessed, able to flourish for your good and for the good of the rest of the world, for those all around you, those you come into contact, and waves of people whom you'll never meet. As a reminder as well that God's gifts of blessing are to be enjoyed and to be shared on behalf of all peoples for the good of all creation. Amen.